There's a video out there by CollegeHumor that alleges that religious people are nerds.
No, I'm talking about this kind of religious person.
Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard the greatest story ever told?
Now, I found this video pretty annoying, and not even primarily because I disagree with it, but because I had already come to a similar insight by the time it had come out, and I felt a little bit ripped off, so partially my dislike for this video comes from sheer envy. The video alleges that, like nerds, religious people obsess about their source material, bicker about minutia, even dress up funny. Now, I think the analogies between religious people and nerds runs even deeper than this video realizes, largely because it doesn't really know what it's talking about.
Mark 21:12 clearly states that we're...
That's not a real verse. No, long before the modern nerds were creating online encyclopedias about their favorite universes, Christians were already doing that with the Bible. Long before nerds had to explain away contradictions and scientific inaccuracies in their holy books, Christians had that down to a science in itself. Poring over genealogies, trying to work out chronologies, yep, the church is way ahead of you on that stuff, guys. Saying that religious people are like nerds is like saying that my wife looks like my daughter. I'll come back to this point later. But CollegeHumor isn't just pointing this out as a funny observation. It has a moral.
Nerdiness is so extreme it's actually dangerous. How many people have died because the Bible nerds couldn't get along with the Quran nerds, or the Torah nerds hate the Bible nerds? Do you see what I'm talking about?
To the Ren Fair!
Point is, there's nothing wrong with faith or spirituality or worship, but if you're the kind of person who will obsess over something to the point where you're literally gonna kill another human, perhaps you should get a less intense hobby than religion.
And this is where the video goes from being passably funny and interesting and insightful to being all kinds of stupid. First of all, if anyone is fanatical enough about their religion to kill for it, do you really think a smirky online video is going to make them rethink their life? But, of course, I'm taking that part way too literally. This is actually primarily directed at your typical fundamentalist, which is to say someone who takes their beliefs seriously and is vocal and active about it, and saying, hey, you know how obnoxious and rude nerds can be when they talk about their obsessions? Well, that's how you come across, so you should really dial it back, and so you don't come across like that really dorky guy from your nephew's D&D group down the street. And that misses something so blisteringly obvious that it's what takes this video from being just kind of a waste of time to being outright stupid. Let me ask, what is worth getting vocal and assertive about? Oppression of women in Islamic societies, violence against homosexuals, destruction of the environment, wars about religion apparently, since this video felt the need to get vocal and assertive about it. Now, why is it acceptable to get upset and proactive about those things and not about Game of Thrones lore? Well, I'd say the answer is pretty blindingly obvious, because those things matter in the real world and have actual serious consequences on people's lives. Human trafficking is real. The Stark and Lannister clans are not. And this is why the Bible is different from Terry Goodkind, Battlestar Galactica, and Robert Jordan, because it claims to be true. It claims that we are in fact in a state of sin and alienation from God, a real condition of hell that we've created for ourselves, and that God has really offered a remedy to that in the form of the gospel after he entered into real human history to die for our sins and reconcile us to himself. Now, it may be that the Bible has made up a condition that we're in, and made up a solution for it. Dianetics also claims to be true. It was created by a science fiction author. It has a much better claim, I'd say, to be a nerd religion. So, of course, certainly, it's not the only book that claims to be that. But, by virtue of it making that claim, it is, de facto, different from the kind of things that this video is talking about. This is exactly the point that j.r.r. Tolkien had to drill into C.S. Lewis, himself a consummate nerd, when he was still a young unbeliever specializing in mythology.
But perhaps it isn't his story, perhaps it's only your story. How can you know that your story, the story that you believe, the Christian story, is any more real than the other story?
But don't you see, it isn't my story, it's his story. You're acting as if Christianity is one myth among many. It's not, it's the true myth. Christianity really happened. Jesus really existed, so did Pilate, and yet it is this true story that makes sense of all the other stories. It is the archetype. It is the story in which all the other stories have their source, and the story to which all the other stories point. It has everything.
The story of Lewis's conversion brings up a kind of interesting point that the CollegeHumor video doesn't really touch upon, which is, why do people become nerds? Like, what is the psychological reason or origin for this phenomenon? Well, in my experience, the two demographics most likely to produce nerds are practicing devout Christians or pretty avid atheists, and I suspect that their attraction and nerdiness in the two separate cases are very, very different in origin. But to kind of get into that, we have to get into the origins of the modern phenomenon of nerdiness, which, I think it's worth pointing out, was largely invented by Christians, which is why I mentioned earlier how similar modern nerdiness is to what Christians have been doing for centuries. That wasn't just to gloat that Christians have done everything that modern people like to do earlier and better, although that also happens to be true. It seems to me that it all goes back to the Sherlock Holmes stories of Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle himself was a lapsed Catholic with a deep devotion to spiritualism, but the practice of poring over his detective stories with an eye towards applying the methods of higher criticism to them was largely spearheaded by Christians. Father Ronald Knox, the Catholic apologist and scholar, was the first to begin writing scholarly essays about the Holmes canon. Note the scriptural connotation of that term, which assured us that Dr. Watson was the real author and Arthur Conan Doyle was just his literary agent. Yet this was invented by a Catholic priest. Father Knox was one of the founders of the Detection Club, which was a society of mystery writers which included the Catholic apologist G.K. Chesterton, who had also been a friend of Doyle's and even drew some unused illustrations for the Sherlock Holmes stories. Dorothy Sayers was another member. Dorothy Sayers was also a Christian writer and apologist who came up with the theory that Dr. John H. Watson's middle initial stood for Hamish, since in one story his wife calls him John. This theory, along with a lot of other speculation about Sherlock Holmes, was later enshrined by William S. Baring-Gould's biography of Sherlock Holmes, which treated the great detective as if he were a real historical figure. Baring-Gould was the grandson of Sabine Baring-Gould, an Anglican priest who wrote the hymn Onward Christian Soldiers, and who was renowned for his scholarship into medieval legends about ghost stories and folklore, so it seems appropriate that his grandson would have crafted the main mythology of the modern age. Dorothy Sayers went even further with her character, Lord Peter Wimsey. In addition to translating Dante's Divine Comedy, developing a Christian theory of artistic creation, and advocating a return to classical education, Sayers somehow found the time to craft an entire genealogy for the Wimsey family, going all the way back to the Norman invasion of 1066 and even from there back to Adam and Eve. This woman was way ahead of all of us. Meanwhile, a Roman Catholic author named Auguste Derleth contacted Arthur Conan Doyle asking whether he could write his own Sherlock Holmes stories. Doyle politely declined, so instead Derleth just ripped him off, in the character of Solar Pons, who, along with his sidekick Dr. Parker, is very clearly a thinly veiled Holmes and Watson. But Derleth's most famous for creating the Cthulhu mythos. H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, both hopelessly nihilistic atheists, had corresponded in separately written fiction which took place in a shared universe they had jointly created, a world where horrifying old ones threatened the universe and had haunted us since our earliest days, when Conan the Barbarian roamed the earth. But Derleth was the first one to systematize this universe, writing his own stories and giving a fuller explanation of what Lovecraft was depicting, essentially world-building. It's worth noting that his Christian worldview prompted him to inject hope into Lovecraft's hopeless cosmos. Derleth's mythos is much more about a struggle between good and evil than about the inevitable triumph of evil. Incidentally, Derleth makes it clear that Solar Pons exists in the Cthulhu mythos. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention the Inklings, that band of the ultimate Christian proto-nerds, Tolkien, Lewis, Charles Williams, and so on. Out of this club poured the Chronicles of Narnia, the Space Trilogy, and the entire universe of Middle-earth, which have been inestimably important in shaping the concept of nerdiness. It's also worth mentioning that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, were also both deeply committed Christians, and so there's your origin of role-playing games right there. I'd suggest the whole concept of games like that is pretty inseparable from Tolkien's concept of subcreation, which is of course tied to the concept of the image of God. Why this 101 course on the history of modern nerdery? Well, I want to make the point that it's not just that nerds share some things in common with religious people. Actually, it was the very fact that religion had molded the minds of the creators of modern nerdery a certain way. It created certain courses of thought along which they could reason that gave rise to modern nerdery. It was religion, specifically the Christian religion, the religion of revelation, that gave them the idea that there was a plan, a story behind the universe. that it could be a big vast universe and every part of it interconnected with each other. This all comes from a view of providence. The idea that the kind of texts that describe the grand plan behind this universe could both be loved, it could both have a deep personal significance, and it could also be dissected, just like the Bible is both very meaningful and personal and devotional, but can also be taken apart and examined scholarly. All of these things, in a scholarly fashion I should say, all of these things came from religion and informed the people who created the modern mythology that nerds kind of dip their minds into. But here's the interesting and essential thing. Even though religion gave them a sense of the world, kind of a flavor of how the world worked that informed the way that they created all these things, the fact that they believed in the true myth, in the reality of the Christian faith, is what kept this as a hobby. It kept all of these kind of little fascinations and projects of theirs as being exactly that. Sure, they took them seriously. Clearly, they took these things very seriously. They took their fiction and their little universes they created seriously, but they didn't obsess about them, and it didn't become idolatrous, because that's precisely what it was. It was an expression of a worldview shaped by what they thought was really, really true, and that's what got the brunt of their true affection, their true devotion, their true ultimate seriousness. And that's where I think Christian nerds are different from atheist nerds. I think Christian nerds see in science fiction stories and fantasy stories an echo of how they believe the universe really is. And that's why they enjoy it, because it resonates, because it rings true. Atheists, I think, are different. I think the reason atheists are attracted to kind of nerdy type mythologies is because their view of the world and the universe is that it is very drab. It's beautiful. It's very vast and stellar and spectacular, but there's no hope to it. There's no joy in it. It has nothing to offer us. And that is very, very difficult to bear psychologically. And that's why nerdiness offers a reprieve from that. Atheists will often say to Christians something along the lines of, why postulate the existence of heaven and angels when our universe is already so beautiful and amazing? Why complicate matters by adding more? Isn't this enough?
Isn't this enough? Just this world? Just this beautiful, complex, wonderfully unfathomable natural world? How does it so fail to hold our attention that we have to diminish it with the invention of cheap, man-made myths and monsters?
And to that I say, you tell me. You tell me why your bookshelf almost certainly has more fantasy novels and science fiction than it has science textbooks, and why you almost certainly get way more excited about David Tennant than you do about quantum physics. Isn't this world enough? I don't think it is. I don't think it's how we're wired, and I don't think it can be satisfying, which is precisely why atheists not only love a lot of nerdy stuff, but get very defensive of it. They get a lot fiercer about, who their favorite Doctor is, or which was the best Star Wars prequel, than Christians will. Because nerdiness gives their lives meaning, but it doesn't give them hope. And just like the pagan gods of old, it doesn't protect them, so they have to defend it. That, you see, is the difference between atheists getting really, really excited about what they're into, and Christians getting really, really excited about what we're into. We're excited because our God is alive. The Romanian philosopher and historian of religion Mircea Eliade speaks of the human being as being homo religiosus, that is, an inherently religious being who uses myth and ritual to define what is ultimately real, that is to say the sacred, and to escape from the hopelessness of secular history. I submit that fanboy obsessions are just a post-Christian example of this. The fact that L. Ron Hubbard, a science fiction writer, created his own religion doesn't so much suggest to me that religion is science fiction, so much as it does that he realized that science fiction was filling the role once played by religion, which is what some of the more honest secular nerds out there will admit. Now, if you really disagree with all that, consider this passage from The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. In it, a witch lures the heroes into what is clearly supposed to be Plato's cave, and is very effective at casting a spell on them to convince them that nothing above the land, nothing like Aslan, nothing like the sun, none of that really exists, until finally Puddleglum gets fed up and gives this powerful speech.
There is one thing to say. Suppose we have only dreamed and made up these things, like sun, sky, stars, and moon, and Aslan himself. In that case, it seems to me that the made-up things are a good deal better than the real ones. And if this black pit of a kingdom is the best you can make, then it's a poor world. And we four can make a dream world to lick your real one hollow.
How dare you threaten me!
As for me, I shall live like a Narnian. Even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you very much for supper, we're going to leave your court at once and make our way across your great darkness to search for our land above.
Well said, Cunningham.
C.S. Lewis obviously intended that line to be a defense of sorts of religious faith. Can you honestly tell me that it also couldn't serve as a manifesto of sorts for a lot of internet nerdery? A few years ago, the Westboro Baptist Church, apparently dissatisfied with their current level of douchebaggery, decided to up the stakes by protesting Comic-Con, and accusing the nerds there of being idolatrous for worshipping gods other than the Lord. This led to some pretty funny counter-protests, honestly. But in accusing a lot of atheist nerdery of being substitute religion, am I just doing the same thing and calling all you guys idolaters? Well, I definitely think sometimes nerdiness can be a form of idolatry. And I don't think I'm the only one either. Mark Millar's comic series Wanted is all about an average, boring guy who breaks out of his humdrum life to become one of the most awful, heartless, depraved killers in probably all of comic book history. And the ending kind of accuses the reader of being just as bad as he is, of having, male power fantasies themselves. Kind of suggesting that if a lot of comic book readers were to actually get superpowers, they would promptly become supervillains. This is the real meaning of the title, not just that it's about wanted criminals, but that it's about people who people want to be like. And I would say that that kind of lust for power, which I do believe probably does fuel a lot of comic book readers, is indeed a form of idolatry. Mark Millar, for the record, is himself a devout and practicing Catholic. But on the whole, I'm actually a lot more optimistic about nerdiness. I don't so much view it as idolatry as I do a preparation for the gospel, in the same sort of way that the Greek and Roman myths were a preparation for Christianity to build upon. They whet the appetite for God. I would say this. What Tolkien said to Lewis about myths is to a large degree true of modern nerdiness. It's a yearning after God, and it gets at something that's fundamentally true.
You can't seriously believe in fairy tales.
Why not? I can, in fact, I do.
But this is preposterous. How can you seriously believe a lie?
Oh, Jack, myths are not lies. In fact, they're the very opposite of a lie. Myths convey the essential truth, the primal reality of life itself.
Go on.
Well, you see, we have been duped into using the word myth as being synonymous with a lie, because we have been duped into accepting the first real lie of materialism.
And what is that?
That is the hideous claim that there is no supernatural order to the universe. The materialists have imprisoned us in a world of mere matter, of physical facts, divorced from and devoid of metaphysical truth. And this is where myths come in, you see. Myths exist outside the prison. Myths allow us to escape from the prison. Or if we are not able to escape, at the very least, they allow us to catch a fleeting but oh so powerful glimpse of the beauty that lies beyond the walls. You're acting as if myths are mere arbitrary inventions of fiction, as if we pull them out of thin air. But what you don't understand is that we make things by the law in which we are made. We create because we are created. Creativity, imagination, is God's imageness in us. We tell stories because God is a storyteller. Christianity really happened. Jesus really existed, so did Pilate, and yet it is this true story that makes sense of all the other stories. It is the archetype. It is the story in which all the other stories have their source, and the story to which all the other stories point. It has everything. It has catastrophe and its opposite. what we might call eucatastrophe. It has the joy of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn in the story that is essential to all myths. It has to a sublime degree this joy of deliverance, this evangelium, this fleeting glimpse of the real joy, to which all other joys are but a distant echo.
I want to say one last thing to any Christian nerds who might be watching. The new evangelization is something that the Catholic magisterium has been very strong on. With the new media and everything else, we have all sorts of new venues of spreading the gospel, and we need to take advantage of them. But the bishops and the cardinals, they're busy. The Pope doesn't have time to really, pore over Battlestar Galactica and Firefly and talk about that, but we do. I mean, this is where we have a real advantage. If I'm right, and these kind of new mythologies are a new preparation for the gospel, then we need to be very, very alert to it. We have to keep one eye always open on what's kind of going into the minds of educated, thoughtful people in the world. What is the current kind of nerd fad, so that we both know what to rebuke about the world, and also to see what it's specifically crying out for, so that we can kind of offer the gospel, I think, in a more comprehensible way. I have some friends who are already doing a really, really good job of this, in my opinion. My friend John runs a website about this kind of stuff called bombadillo.net, which I sometimes write for. My friend Christian has a blog that he writes about this kind of stuff on, and I really like it. And my friend Josh was on a podcast about exactly this called Cross Purposes. Go check that out too. If you're a Christian who's really into nerdy stuff, I encourage you to not only take advantage of those resources, but also be willing, with prayer, because there's always a temptation to pride, but be willing to create something of your own like that. Either create your own kind of pop culture analysis website or YouTube page, or even create your own nerdy stuff. I mean, with DeviantArt and everything else, it is so easy to kind of put things out there that express your worldview and that can be viewed by a lot of people. Don't be afraid, Don't be afraid to let the Spirit use you in that way. And if you have no inclination for things like that, please pray for those artists who are out there and for people like me who have no artistic skill but like to talk about stuff like this. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was informative. My last word is, religious people aren't nerds. Nerds are religious people. And you need to realize that and own up to it. Take care.